Good morning and welcome to the Computer History Museum. It's January 28, 2019. I'm here with Eff Martin. Welcome to the museum, Eff.
Marguerite, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
My name is Marguerite Hancock, and I'm the Executive Director at Exponential Center, and we've been looking forward to having a chance to record your story. I'd like to start at the very beginning, if you don't mind, and ask you to, for the record, tell us your full name and where and when you were born. How did your life begin?
Well, my full name is Eff Warren Martin. I was born in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and grew up there. Many people ask where I got my first name, which is EFF, and I actually got that from my grandfather, who was born in rural Texas in 1884. And a neighboring farm woman came over and saved his mother's life in childbirth, and they named the child after her, Effie Lynch, E-F-F-I-E, Effie Lynch Martin. And that was a pretty rough name to carry in those days. He actually ran away from home when he was 8 years old, and when he was 18, had his name legally shortened to EFF. And he died just before I was born, and I inherited his name. So I spent my 18 years there, going through high school at Cassady High School, which I felt very fortunate because I got quite a good education, and my parents were very serious about education. They had lived through the Depression and the Dust Bowl, and so there was a lot of passion and effort and desire to be better and to make life better. I ended up going to Rice University. My father was mistrustful of either coast, and we determined Rice was the best school in the sort of the middle of the country, and we had a lot of Texas relatives and background anyway. So I went to Rice, became a mechanical engineer. I stayed there for 4 years undergrad and then one more year to get a master's degree. And
before we go on, I'd like to just go back to a little bit of the early years and ask you a few details. You mentioned about your father, and could you tell us about the members of your family and help us envision what was your home like?
Well, I had the benefit of having wonderful parents and a very stable home. My dad always said that we were middle class, and with some pride. They had been raised he had been raised on a ranch in western Oklahoma. My mother had been raised in Pampa, Texas, in the Panhandle, where her father had started a bank, First National Bank of Pampa, Texas. And when they got married, they lived on the ranch in very difficult circumstances. And then the war came, and my dad was an investigator in the war. And it turned out, without knowing it, he did security clearances for people who worked at Los Alamos on the atomic bomb project. But when the war was over, they were still in western Oklahoma and western Texas ranching. And my grandfather, for whom I'm named, died. So literally, they sold the ranch to pay the taxes and moved into Oklahoma City. And shortly thereafter, I was born. And so I had a very happy home life. I had one sister who was 3 years older. My dad was a wonderful man. He was a little antisocial in some ways. He did not like the country club set. He liked the common man. He rejoiced in farmers and people who were just out doing their work. And I remember that there was a big turkey farm in Guthrie, Oklahoma, near there, and we would go every year and pick up like 50 turkeys and take them to people that my dad liked, and they were always the humble people of the world, because that's who he resonated with. But he was a brilliant man. An insatiable reader, and I'll never forget just stacks of books everywhere in our house, and along his bedside. And I still have these stacks of books by my bedside, and my wife's always saying, "You got to clean those up." And I go, "No, I got this from my dad." And so he was a brilliant man. Actually went to University of Oklahoma and dropped out because he was so young. He actually started when he was 14 years old and dropped out, though, because he wasn't fitting in socially, and then went back to work. And in those days, he had a rather unusual career path. He went directly to the University of Texas Law School and graduated there. My mom was a little more conventional than my dad. She was a fantastic woman, Phi Beta Kappa at Oklahoma. She was the all Big Six shortstop on the women's softball team at University of Oklahoma. And I remember fondly that when I grew up, I was very short and small. And so about the only sport I could aspire to play was baseball. And they would take me out. I mean, we would get up at 5:30 and go practice ground balls, and my dad would hit me fungos. But my mom would, I'd throw the ball back to her, and she'd throw it to my dad, and she was great. But that was part of their devotion to me and their encouragement of me. And then again, they really did emphasize family and academics. Those were just two great messages, along with what I mentioned earlier, this fundamental value of every human being, and not just the major success stories in life.
Well, thank you for sharing that background. It really gives us a window into your early years. You talk about these books that were surrounding you on all sides. What were some of the ideas or issues that were in your young life, and did you have an inkling in those early years about what things would become your own passions besides as you pursued your family and your academics?
Well, my dad was such a voracious reader. He read everything. But the ones that I remember the most were history, books about history, biographies, going whether it was Alexander the Great or whether it was Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, just the whole span of history. And he was something of an insomniac. And so he would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and then just read for the next 4 or 5 hours. And that permitted him a lot of time. So I got a great love of history from my dad. And actually, if I hadn't ended up being an engineer, I might have been a historian.
What period do you think captured your imagination? A particular place or period?
Well, I have two passions, actually. One is ancient history, from the Greeks and Alexander up through Rome, and then the second is the sort of the Renaissance, kind of 1500 to 17 or 1800 in Europe. And I don't know why particularly I fell in love with that period of time, but I guess it was the emergence of Western civilization in many ways out of the Dark Ages.
Yeah, that flourishing, both of those times were times when the ideas fundamentally changed the world. Those, I think, the ancient time and those times. So you mentioned that you attended Cassady, which was an Episcopal day school, is that right?
Right. It was founded by Bishop Cassady in, I think, 1949. It was a small school. My class was, graduating class in high school was only 57. But we had wonderful teachers, and there was an actual humanities focus. So I got to study Latin, French, and German all in high school, and along with sort of physics and chemistry and math and history and English, etc.
And then you made the decision to go to Rice. It was a solid institution in the center of the country, to be trusted.
Right.
And how did you choose your major?
Well, when I went, my dad, coming out of the Depression, they said, you can have whatever desires you want, but you got to do something to get a job, because it was a different world then. And today, when you hear speakers at most college graduations, they say, follow your dreams, have faith, just go for it. coming out of the Depression and World War II, the message was make sure you can support yourself. We were more concerned with survival than we were, following your dreams. And so my dad encouraged me to be in, some kind of engineering, since I had a natural inclination toward math. And then he also had encouraged me, even from the beginning, to do something with business. And so when I started at Rice, a lot of the same interests emerged, but I was just drawn toward mathematical things. And in those days, the engineering wasn't segregated into all the different art forms it is today. And so mechanical engineering was one of the broadest, and it really had computer science within it. Some of that, of course, went over into electrical engineering. But I have this degree in mechanical engineering, and I can't fix anything. But it was more applied math, and I loved applied math, and that was really where my heart was, game theory and all sorts of things that are now called operations research, et cetera. And that's what I actually got excited about. But I did take a ton of other of the courses because I always liked the history and the economics and things like that as well.
As you found your way through being an ME, mechanical engineering, do you remember any classes or professors that really kind of ignited your interest in this field?
Well, I remember the classes of about advanced math. I lo these many years later, I couldn't possibly tell you the name of the class, but I remember studying things like Fourier's transforms and all these kinds of things that it was just fun to see the intricate relationship of them. And so I just loved the math parts, and that would be probably where the things that were inspiring.
Well, you were an exceptional student. I think you were a member of Phi Beta Kappa, right? And Tau Beta Pi. Was there any room or time in your life for any other extracurricular activities?
Well, I played baseball for 2 years there, and I wasn't very good, but I got to be on the team, and so I loved that a great deal. People ask me what I played. My position was second base, but I actually played first base coach, batting practice, pitcher. That's really what I did for a couple of years. And but as we got into engineering, it was pretty funny. We were taking these bus trips from Houston to Lubbock, Texas, is 800 or 900 miles, and that is one hellacious bus trip. And I remember one night, my sophomore year, coming back on this 16 or 18-hour bus trip trying to write a lab report, and I just said, this isn't working. And since I really wasn't very good anyway, I retired from baseball, but a lot of pain inside for that because I think I'd gotten a lot of my identity from it. But still, I just loved sports. And so we had all sorts of intramural teams, and I worked for the Rice Sports Information Department, which was great, and I did lots of scorekeeping. And I remember one of the fun things was I actually, when the first big old Fortran computers came out, I wrote a program that would automate the stats from all the baseball games, because there were a lot of baseball games. And so I remember punching them out on these punch cards and putting them in there. All the thing did, it was sort of like an adding machine. I mean, it was so primitive, but it wasn't one of these great big old computers that was large and the cards would go and so it was pretty fun, and that was I enjoyed that a great deal. So sports has been a passion of mine forever.
That's great. So was that in fact your first time that you interacted or were doing hands-on work with a computer?
Yeah, it was.
So how did you come up with this idea, and what did you access the computer? Did you need to run them batches at night, or how did this work?
Well, they had a computer for the engineers, for the engineering groups, and I don't recall specifically, but I presume we all got some sort of training on it to some modest extent. And so I found that it was extremely tedious hand doing every single statistic for baseball. In baseball, they keep infinite numbers of statistics. And I just thought it'd be fun to see if I couldn't automate this and cut down some of the work. And I liked it anyway, so it was a little bit of a challenge.
That's a terrific story. So any other experiences that kind of stand out to you from your Rice years that you'd like to share?
Rice was a great school. One of the interesting things was that it was really hard, and being an engineer was really hard. And so I remember, this is like one of those stories about how I walked to work, 6 hours in the snow. But we actually had classes on that went Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And one good thing about this, in retrospect, not that I enjoyed it at the time, was that we learned some disciplines about really working hard. And I remember I was there, I left Rice in 1971, and that was the time the Vietnam War had created great foment, and college campuses in particular. Rice was pretty conservative, but still, it was everywhere. And I remember the SDS was going to have a big demonstration at Rice, one of the first ones. And I was with one of my buddies who was an engineer, and we were walking back, and at the end of a long week, and I asked him if he was going to go to the rally, and he said, if I had time to go to that rally, I'd take a nap. And so it was a time of a lot of intense effort. And I wouldn't say that all of it was fun, but I think it was a great training ground.
You mentioned this job that you had with the sports on campus. Was that in fact your first job, or had you started working earlier in your life?
Well, let's see. I worked on the farm for my dad. My dad had a couple of quarter sections, and so he really believed in work. And so when I was in high school, I worked on the farm. He paid me 50 cents an hour. And then at the end of the summer, just because he knew that was low, he gave me $10. But I did that all the way.
What were you doing? Were there crops?
We had on one quarter section we had wheat, and but we had a farmer, a real farmer who planted and harvested and everything. But there was a lake, and we planted pecan trees, and so I used to go around and water these pecan trees and take care of them when they were young. And then on the other quarter section, we had, it was grasses and lakes and stuff like that. And so we actually had, 20 cattle, and we had some hogs and a few different animals, and I would go up and help feed those. But one of the big things I did was drive a tractor around and mow it. It was, and I enjoyed that, but only a little bit. So I did that, and then after my freshman year in college, I was back at home, and I played baseball in the summer leagues. And I think I must have still worked on the farm. But starting after my sophomore year, I worked sophomore and junior summers at General Dynamics in the quality assurance. We were building the F-111 fighter bomber, which was pretty cool, at Carswell Air Force Base. And then in the next 3 summers after, I guess, senior year, graduate school year, and then the middle year of business school, I worked for Atlantic Richfield in the North American Producing Division in Dallas, and I did a variety of engineering kind of calculations. And I remember the first one I did was we helped design what they call tank farms, where they store gas and things when they come out of the ground. And that was okay, but it's sort of boring. But then my last year there, I worked on this project to analyze whether when ARCO was bidding in these offshore oil auctions, whether they were overpaying or just to somehow figure out, are we doing a good job at this? And so that was really fun, because that went all back into game theory and analysis of the applied math that I loved. And that actually had an important role because at that time I was in business school trying to decide what to do, and it was that love of applied math and markets that led me away from strict engineering, ultimately to investment banking.
Let's hold that. That's really key. I want to make sure that we catch up a little bit and understand your decision, what you did after Rice, and then how you decided to ultimately come to Stanford Business School.
Well, in those days, there was not this kind of enforced go out and get a job. There were a number of us that actually went just straight through school. And so my father encouraged me to get a business degree, and the thought was I would probably come back and be in the oil business, but that with a business degree I could rise into management and it would give me more opportunities. And it made a lot of sense to me. So I applied to a limited number of schools and was fortunate enough to get into Stanford. And that really was the one I had my heart set on. The other was Harvard, but Harvard was East Coast, it was cold. Stanford actually, its architecture looks like Rice, and I came out here and blue skies, good weather. It just seemed a lot more the kind of place a person like me would like, and so I came to Stanford and went through so that period it gave me 7 straight years of college, so I was quite ready to graduate when that finally ended.
So you came to Stanford in 1971.
Right.
And can you describe, besides the blue skies, what was Silicon Valley? Those were early days for the Valley in those days. What was it like for you at that time?
Well, first of all, to put this in perspective, I was at 20, I think I was still only 20, I was 22 years old when we started Stanford Business School. And I had led a pretty sheltered life, Oklahoma and Texas primarily. And, today students go to Hong Kong for, their week off. We would go to Beaumont instead of Tulsa. And so I really was very naive. When I arrived out here, I didn't know much about the technology world at all. I'd actually never even heard the term of investment banking when I arrived at Stanford. I really had very little view of the broader world. And so these next 2 years, probably the greatest thing I got was a vision for the wider world, in both through the Stanford classes, but through the things I was exposed to, and then, of course, simply being on the West Coast. But when I arrived, the technology world was still practically non-existent. I mean, it was very, very small. And so there were a few of the companies that were coming primarily out of the semiconductor phase. Intel had started, National Semiconductor was somewhere in there, but the basic computer ethic was primarily the minis, and they were still back in the Boston area by and large. HP had started, of course, and was going, and that would have been the largest company around. But, that was it. And so it didn't have that big of a footprint. The Valley was still lots and lots of orchards. When I arrived, 280 was being built, but it wasn't complete. And there was some freeway, but you used to drive kind of from Sand Hill Road north quite a ways on just a little 2-lane road. And so I guess the sun had come up, but it was barely dawn by then.
And what was the spirit or ethos of the place as you were looking out at these nascent companies and new industries that were kind of making their mark?
Well, the the technology ethos had been planted in some of these companies, but it really hadn't hit business school yet. And the other thing that happened was, of course, that in late 72, I think, but somewhere in that period, the first Arab oil embargo hit, which sent the United States economy just into a tailspin. And so they were actually pretty dark days. And the jobs that people aspired to in those days were, the number one job was management consulting, and then otherwise it would be some in investment banking. Stanford actually had very little investment banking presence. I think maybe in my whole class only 4 or 5 of us went into investment banking. And then there were still low. We had lots of people go to work for major actual operating companies, and I don't actually know of many people. I'm hard pressed to think of anybody that went to a startup, because that just hadn't happened yet.
So these 2 years opened your mind to new possibilities, and then you, as you mentioned, you made this critical decision to pursue your passion for markets and the math and investment. Was that a gradual decision, or was there some kind of an aha moment where you said, this is what I'm going to do?
Well, it was kind of funny. As I mentioned, the economy was fading fast, and lots of people who came to campus didn't offer jobs. And then actually, as it turned out later, some people who had offered jobs rescinded them. And so I, of course, came into this to get a job. That was a job, and then we'd decide what kind of job. And it was interesting. In the fall, I did a lot of interviewing, and I didn't have much success, even with companies that, honestly, I should have gotten job offers from, but it didn't happen. And I remember one of the funniest ones was the company was McKinsey that everybody wanted to get a job offer from. And my mother knew the mother of one of the managing partners up in San Francisco. And so through this little network, they arranged for me to come up well before the interviewing on campus. And so I got to meet everybody, and I thought I had a great day. And about, 4 or 5 days later, I got this letter, and it said, "Dear Eff, gosh, it was great to see you. We enjoyed having you up here. Thank you so much for coming. After very great reflection, we've decided that we'll not be able to offer you a job. We just don't think you're mature enough." And so anyway, that was sort of a crushing blow. But in many ways, I am very grateful for it, because truthfully, I think they were right. I don't think I was mature enough, being so young and coming up, and I was not, mature beyond my years. And secondly, truthfully, that isn't where my heart would have been. My heart was in investment banking, and so I regard that as actually one of those things that a little hard on the pride, but very good for your life. And but I think I was 0 for 10. And so I started to get worried about whether I was going to get a job. And so finally, though, a few things came together, and I had job offers from commercial banks, 2 commercial banks, 2 investment banks, and then Arco, that I was still thinking very seriously about, because they treated me super well and they were a great company. And so I kind of went from being all worried about whether I was going to get a job offer at all to being worried about which job I could take. But I actually not only thought a lot about it, but my Christian faith had developed at that time, and so I prayed a lot about it. And I just came to this conclusion that going to work for Dean Witter in San Francisco would be a great place for me. I thought some of the other ones were smaller or in other places, and it just seemed like that was the right place, and that would give me more options going forward. So I remember I was headed at the end of spring break, or at the beginning of spring break, to Hawaii with my buddy for vacation, and I called from the airport and accepted the job with Dean Witter just before we got on the plane. That was one great spring break, because you got your job, you're all, I needed one class to graduate my last quarter, so that was a good time.
That's a great, sweet moment. So you celebrated, and then you started there. What were some of who were you working with? kind of your mentor, or who was on whose team were you on, and what were some of your early assignments?
Well, I remember I took 1 week after business school and started, because again, they were really hard times. And I was most eager to make sure I got there, and did get started. But the head of the office was a man named Gus Connect, who was a longtime San Franciscan, very much from the old school. And Dean Witter had the distinction of being the only major bracket investment banking firm headquartered outside of San Francisco. It was primarily a retail brokerage firm, but it had built an investment banking practice based upon having that distribution. And of course, they were also building up their institutional capabilities, primarily in New York as well. But I started working on everything. There were I believe three vice presidents in the office, John Wilson and Emmett DeMoss, and an older gentleman named Howard Tharsing. And so I did work mostly with John and Emmett. And a lot of what started to happen in those days was public utility financing, because we were in the midst of building all the nuclear power plants and other power plants. And so that was a place where Dean Witter could excel, because many of the securities got sold at retail. And so I started working on a lot of things, but that was the biggest thing that I got into early.
Can you, if we were to pull back the telescope a little bit, can you help lay out the context of what the other investment banks were doing at the time, too, so just to give us some context?
Well, we were actually at the end of what I would call the old era, the classic era of investment banking, which was really not as competitive. It was thought to be undignified to go out and hustle for business, and most of the choices of investment banking were based on the old school ties and everything like that. And so the undisputed leader, I would say, when I started, was Morgan Stanley, coming off of the historic strength, and the Merrill Lynch was very well known because it was the massive player in retail. And interestingly enough, there were still a number of firms like Dillon Reed and Lehman Brothers that came out of the earlier history. But Solomon and Goldman Sachs were these firms that were really starting to rise. And Goldman Sachs is so prominent today, many would say the preeminent financial institution in the world, that you don't realize that in the 60s and 1971 in particular, 73, that they were not in that category at all.
And so you were there for, how long were you there with Dean Witter?
10 years, and in fact, I was probably a week short of 10 years, and I remember the day I left, my 10-year watch for Dean Witter arrived as I was walking out. I've still got it, too. But I had a wonderful experience at Dean Witter. I loved Dean Witter, but Sears had bought Dean Witter, and we hit by this was now 1983, we'd hit another kind of air pocket. And Dean Witter had grown to be a very, very good and wonderful firm. But in investment banking, it barely had critical mass. And some of the people I know, Brad Freeman was the head of the LA office. And he was actually the first guy to interview me at Stanford Business School when I was there. And Ron Spogley, so Freeman Spogley. We had a number of us in San Francisco that later went on to do pretty great things. And we'd actually built up a pretty good research staff. But a tough time hit. The Sears made the decision that really had to kind of cut this back. So we couldn't keep investing in the firm. And so we started to lose our research, and then we started to lose some of our trading, and then we started to lose some of our banking. And so the place was just starting to come apart a little bit. And so...
before it started to come apart. What can you just summarize kind of the scale and scope of that? How many employees? What were the sort of size of the?
In San Francisco, I guess we probably had maybe got up to like 25 investment banking employees, maybe 20. LA was a little smaller than that. New York would have been much bigger. New York had built up, and I actually don't remember the revenues, but we were kind of scrappy, and we were winning a lot of things. And I met one of my lifelong friends in 1974, a fellow who's still a partner of mine, named Tom Healy, and he had joined Dean Witter in New York to do project finance, and we ended up winning one of the major opportunities to finance utilities when we won there was a joint plant, a joint effort to build 2 coal-fired power plants in Colstrip, Montana. And we beat everybody for it because we were scrappier and we tried harder, and it was just sort of a place where passion and persistence actually helped. And so Dean Witter was like that in those days. One of the great things that I remember was we won a mandate that I worked on to become the second investment banker for Nordstrom. And the great thing was we replaced Goldman Sachs. And so this was, this would have been probably, 77, 78, but the Nordstroms were some of the finest people God ever made, and it was such a privilege to work with them. And about a year after I had been there, Gus Connick retired, and they brought out a wonderful, wonderful man and talented investment banker named Tom Bertelson, who became one of my primary mentors. And he was just fantastic, and he remains fantastic, lives up in Marin, and I see him occasionally, but he was very, very important to me, not only in training me in investment banking, but in being a counselor about my career.
So that important relationship that came to you, can you say a little bit more about that? What did you look to him for? How did he help shape you? What is it that he did that made such a difference to you?
Well, I have to tell you the start of it. The thing he did was he didn't fire me the first time I met him. I remember he came in, it was January 1st, right after January 1st, so now 1974. Times were really bad. 4 of us had been hired as associates in investment banking. 2 were let go as of Christmas. And so 2 of us remained. And so, again, I'm pretty nervous about all of this. And then they were sending out, a new head from New York. And so we all gathered in the conference room for whatever January 3rd date, when everybody came back to work. And we were there, and, we just sat down, and all of a sudden it turned out that Tom came in. And he sat down next to me on my right and everything. And so I had a coffee cup there. And I said, oh, let me move that. And I went like this. I knocked the coffee cup over. And fortunately, though, it spilled, but the spill stayed on the table. But I was so flustered that I took my napkin and blotted it. And when I blotted it, it made the coffee run off into his lap. So good. This was a horrible start, and of course, most people today, I think it's hilarious, but of course I didn't think it was hilarious when I was now 24 years old and, people were losing jobs. But anyway, but he was a great manager, and he liked people, and again, he was a very strong technical investment banker, and so that was something that maybe we lacked a little bit in San Francisco, and he helped a great deal with that. He was really honest, and if something came up in a meeting with a client, and we had said something and we were very direct, but he could see that the client didn't get the full import of the negative aspect, he would go back and say, look, I just want to make sure you understand this because I don't want to leave you with a misimpression. This is a problem, or we got to fix this, and not necessarily we, the client, but we, Dean Witter. I mean, he was just terrific, and so I think one of the most ethical and upright people that I have met, and so that was a wonderful, wonderful lesson for me to see that that's what you're supposed to be. When I left, I was an extremely loyal person. I think I was a little afraid. Actually, I was afraid of whether I would make it at Goldman or not. And so I thought, well, no, I think I'm just going to stay at Dean Witter. And I went to tell Tom about it. And Tom, even though I was one of the better performers there, and still he said to me, he said, Eff, you owe it to yourself and your family to think about this. You got to go have the meeting. He said, I'd love to have you, but you owe it to yourself. And that was something that I will never forget, because I did go, and then I really fell in love with the people at Goldman Sachs, and I left, and that was been very good for me. And so again, that was Tom, I think, putting people ahead of a narrow business interest, and I will be forever grateful.
Sounds like a remarkable person. So you made that decision. Do you remember that first conversation? What did you talk about, and what is it that helped you fall in love with Goldman?
Well, I remember two early conversations. Initially, I met with Gene Fife, who was the head of the San Francisco office. And then I flew to Los Angeles and met with Peter Barker, who was the regional manager and head of the LA office. And I don't remember very much about it other than, they told me about Goldman Sachs, but thinking what incredible people they were. I mean, just so down to earth, and they remain two of my best friends in life. So down to earth, and all of a sudden I said, Goldman is not this terrible dog-eat-dog place. There are good people here, and they began to explain to me the culture of teamwork, which really was the hallmark of Goldman Sachs. And I had never, going back to my sports days, I really loved team sports and winning rather than tennis or bowling or something like that. And all of a sudden they opened my eyes that this could be pretty interesting. Then they asked me to fly back, and I flew back to New York and met the partner who had been inaugurated with the task of starting a tech group. And his name was Ken Brody, who's a brilliant man, and put in about 10 more brilliants. So he was assembling a team, but they didn't have anybody in Silicon Valley, and so they wanted a person to be Goldman Sachs Silicon Valley. And so I remember just being awestruck by the thoughtfulness with which this effort was being assembled and formulated. And one of the greatest things, not only did it have a good business plan, but they had the full backing of the firm. And so that was really important, because we went through 2 years of really tough times. And every criticism that any competitor would level against Goldman was going to be, they're big, first sign of trouble, they're going to cut and run, they don't care about little companies. But because it had been formulated, it was actually a strategic effort of the firm with good people that everybody trusted, we survived that. And so I really fell in love with what Goldman was doing. But still, it was a tremendous decision for me. And I remember calling my dad, and Dean Witter, I told Dean Witter that this was going, and they made me an extremely attractive offer to stay. And I mean, it was a lot. And I told Goldman about it, and Goldman said, well, we honestly can't match that. They offered me a position on the board, a huge salary increase. But Sears was one of Goldman's greatest clients, and Goldman said, look, we're just going to offer you what we said, which was a good offer, but not anything like Dean Witter's. And they said, look, if you do well, you're going to make that up in the long term. So anyway, I called my dad, and I asked him about it. I thought he'd say, well, gosh, take the bigger offer and go on the board and all that. And he said, go with the quality. He said, take the other one. And so that was a testimony to my father, and so I did. And the other thing about it was Goldman had a saying, don't be long-term greedy, don't be short-term greedy, be long-term greedy. And the idea was don't do what maximizes the short term, do what's right, and in the long term, those rewards will come. And that actually was true with the way we treated clients, but is also true in the way I ended up choosing Goldman Sachs. And then it worked out very well.
Well, I should say it worked out very well. You, what was the year that you started there?
June 1st, 1973.
Okay, June 1st.
1983, excuse
1983.
me. 1983, yeah.
June 1st, 1983. So you were the right person in the right place to start their technology investing in this new burgeoning place of Silicon Valley. What were your first deals? Who were you talking with as you were trying to start your business?
Well, the industry actually was starting to emerge by then, and Apple had come public in 1980. There were the previous existing companies, but there was now a little boomlet in computer companies that were coming out and others. And so the disk drive industry had just, exploded into being. And so we started, we had basically a relationship with National Semiconductor, the historic one, and also with Rome. But that was it. And so one of the things that I thought is that if we wanted to be a real player in Silicon Valley, we had to be involved with the young companies, and that we couldn't just go and try to be HP and Intel's banker and all of that, that we really had to be there in the youth and play that game. And so we went around, we called on venture capitalists, we called on every kind of emerging technology company that we thought we could possibly work with that would be really good. And I remember the first deal we got was a private placement for Maxtor, the high-capacity disk drive company. And I think it was around 20 million, something like that. It was pretty big for a deal like that at that time. And it was really funny because Don Lucas and B.J. Casson were the major venture capitalists, and they'd really reached out to Goldman, and we were working with them. And this deal turned out to be very hard to do. November of 1983, the industry, still struggling a great deal, and there were 54 disk drive companies, and so why would we need one more? And we really struggled, but we actually got it done. Goldman really went to work to get some institutional investors in. I remember Prudential came in, was one of the major ones. And so we got this done. We had the greatest closing party ever, first deal. And it was pretty funny I can remember the joy of that. And then we went on our first IPO was Lam Research. Now, Lam Research is a very major company today. Lam Research was about at the time. I mean, it was really small. Roger Emmerich was the CEO. God bless him. But the company had a bake-off, and we won. And we went. I remember going over there. We'd made our pitches, and they were kind of going back to us, and I'd forgotten everybody else. I'm sure everybody was trying for it. And I took a bottle of champagne over with my partner. It wasn't my partner, the partner, Gene Fife at the time, to go over to express just how much we wanted this. And so I remember I got this bottle of champagne out and said, Roger, we're not leaving until we open this and celebrate. And he said, and then I kind of launched into this little spiel. He said, F, he says, let's just open the champagne. And so, yeah, we did that. And so that was the first IPO. Gosh, it was tiny. I don't remember, but like less than $30 million with probably $100 or $120 million overall market cap. And $6 a share. I mean, it was small. And we priced that, I remember, May 1st, 1984. very poignant for me because I did everything, but I didn't go to the pricing because that was the day my dad died. And so, but, of course, Goldman deal went great and everything, and Lamb became a wonderful client for many, many years. And it didn't take off for a while, though. It was really struggling. I mean, that semiconductor equipment is a tough business. And they used to say that nobody actually knew what went on inside of these chambers, that it was like black magic in there. And so people were just trying to say, well, if we did this and we did that, this happened, we don't know why. But then later on, I mean, it became one of the really landmark companies in Silicon Valley.
I have a little appreciation. I worked for GCA,
Mm-hmm.
my first stepper company, for a little while in Boston, so I have a little appreciation of that. So you celebrated.
We did. And then, though, there had been a number of very, very bad deals done, companies that just cratered right away. I've forgotten them all, but I remember Fortune Systems and others. And so technology fell out of favor. It was a tough market, 83, 84, 85. And so we were really, I mean, it was very hard. And we did some other deals, I think, less than notable. And but nobody was doing much then. And so I remember that, though, we kind of started to come out of it in about the beginning of 1985. And the one of the funniest things was linear technology, the analog semiconductor company came out, Bob Swanson, one of the greatest guys ever. And so we went after that with everything we had, and just there's nothing that we could have done that we didn't do. And I was in New York at one of the training meetings when the decision came, and Bob Swanson called me and he said, "Eff, I just want to tell you," he said, "first of all, I loved working with you. You understood this company better than anybody we ever worked with." He said, "Your research guys were great. I love the depth of your trading and talent, and your senior people are the best. The best we met, and we've decided to go with Morgan Stanley." And I said, "Bob," I said, "how can you say that?" And he said, "Well, I wanted to go with you guys, but the venture capitalists on our board said, well, if you look at all the major deals, they've been done with Morgan Stanley, and Goldman hadn't done one of those yet. And so if you want the imprimatur of this is one of the big deals, you go with Morgan," which I later described as the image is everything decision. But I mean, I tell you, that was a tough blow. Not so much that we missed one deal, but that was a great company, but what it represented was how high the mountain was to climb.
So how did you persist? I mean, these are dark days, right? It's the whole environment is tough. You said you've given it everything to make them love you and choose you, and they did, but they chose somebody else. How did you persist in that that time?
There's two things. One is there really weren't any other options, and second of all, it's just not in my family history to quit. So we kept going. And also I don't know, I think it maybe is my faith. I have a basic optimism about life. And so, and one of the great things I learned throughout, we lost a lot of business in my 22 years at Goldman Sachs. But I learned that you're never out of it. And we lost a lot of IPO business where we became their major banker and then did all the business thereafter because we just never quit, and we never threw a temper tantrum when they didn't choose us. And so I guess that was kind of the DNA of Goldman Sachs and of mine. So we just kept going. And then later in about mid-year in 1985, we got a call that Microsoft wanted to choose its investment bankers and that they were going to go public. And so I'd been up there once and met Frank Gaudet, the CFO, and he said he's coming to New York, and he was going to meet with, I don't know, 3 or 4 firms. And so he did, and he met with us, and came back, and I was, of course, there and went back home. And then he called me up, and just as I was headed, it was in early December, I was headed to our year-end conference, and he said, he said, I really like you guys. He says, I want to introduce you to Bill and John Shirley, and do you think you can make it out here next week? And I said, yeah, I think we can. And so anyway, I was just getting on the plane. I go to New York. We rally the troops and everything. We come up and we went out to meet Bill and John, and at a dinner.
This December?
This is December of 1985. And so anyway, that was tension filled. But anyway, we did have a good dinner, and it was a little strained because what do you talk about? And none of our guys really knew them and anything. So, but over dinner, we started to talk about the deal. And I remember Bill, when we got into that, going into his, rocking mode and everything. And so he...
what triggered that when you knew he was engaged? Because you said it was awkward, and there...
Well, we started to talk not about the general market. We started to talk about the deal itself and how we would approach it, and what would, who would do what, and what our vision for it was. And the funny thing was, our vision for this deal was far more accurate than Bill's. Bill was very conservative, and he said, I want to be realistic about this, and so. We portrayed this as one of the great seminal deals of any time, and Bill kind of went, well, maybe not, and even when we had the suggested pricing, the only time in my entire career that the client told me to cut the price, and we kind of went, well, okay, so didn't know, but then of course. The demand for this offering was fantastic, and the deal did become very, very significant, and of course the company became historic. But I remember, though, we left that dinner, and we got up very early. They were flying back to New York, and I went back to San Francisco on some 5:45 a.m. plane. And when I got there, I was again going on back to New York, and Frank called up. And Frank said, well, how do you think you did? And I said, Frank, I don't know, and I really don't think my opinion matters very much about this. And he says, well, we want to have a organizational meeting on Tuesday. If you're here for it, you can be the lead banker. And so I said, oh, thank you. So that was probably the turning point of our entire effort in technology, because it gave us the standing that we dealt with the best and the brightest, and so we could compete, toe to toe. Now, many others did great work, and we lost other deals, but never again was it because I think that just you're not in the category anymore, and so that was a great day for us.
Well, congratulations. That was a great day. So Frank was the CFO. Who was given responsibility to make the decision. And as other accounts say, that he did really serious due diligence about looking at a lot of other options, including ones who had been other stiff competitors for you. And I was reading that he had this chart of 19 different categories where he ranked everybody. Mm-hmm. How do you describe on why ultimately they chose you?
Well, I think it's really kind of 2 reasons. One was Frank really liked the coordination between Goldman Sachs' investment banking, equity capital markets, and then sales distribution areas. And so he saw that there was actual real value added in that, in the ability to know the market, to be able to sell the securities, and get feedback from the market. So that was probably the thing on a technical standpoint that he liked most about Goldman. And also, we did have a phenomenal research analyst named Rick Sherland, which didn't hurt a bit. But the thing that was maybe more subjective was Frank was a street fighter. He was New York. He came up. You didn't push Frank around, and he was a wonderful man, but one he liked mixing it up. I mean, he did, and I think he saw in Goldman a firm that was still, building, fighting, scrapping, not the old white shoe. We were coming up and making our way in the world, and I think he really liked that.
So this was a culture that you helped create and shape. You were recruiting your team and connecting the dots among the other parts. How did you?
Well, honestly, I wouldn't actually put it like that.
Okay, please help me understand.
I was a very integral part of the team, but it was a team, and we had tremendous strength in New York. Ken Brody was there for a year and a half or 2 years, and then he gave way to Peter Fahey, who was a partner in corporate finance, and we had wonderful people like Rick Sherland and Mary Henry and John Levinson and Dan Benton in our research over time. And so not too long after Microsoft, Brad Koenig came, and it really, there was two things. One, it was a team effort of everybody, and I got to include Eric Dobkin in equity capital markets and many others, Lot and Fit. But it was also the culture of the firm as a whole. And that really goes way back to Sidney Weinberg and the German-Jewish family heritage that the firm was born with. And so what we did was we took what was essentially Goldman Sachs and we put it into the technology world. And I guess you could give us credit for not screwing it up. But it really represented the total effort of the firm and many people. And that's what sustained it all these years.
So I'd like to ask you, help pull back the curtain a little bit into understanding what you and your other members of your team actually did for the Microsoft taking it public. People often don't understand the role of a great investment banker in terms of doing due diligence, assessing risk, understanding the market, setting a price, being partners on talking to getting the institutional investors. Can you walk us through some of the key decision points for the Microsoft experience as a case, kind of to say what were some of the issues and turning points, and what did you and your team do?
Well, as you just suggested, one of the first things one starts with is designing an overall strategy. And really there was nothing unusual about that. Help scope out a timeline. They had decided they wanted to go public, not because they needed any money, but because it had been private for quite a while, and a number of the employees deserved liquidity, and Bill saw that and wanted to do it. The first thing we really did was to spend a lot of time doing due diligence and preparing the preliminary prospectus, and that meant putting together the team, and the company had its team of attorneys, and led by then Frank Godet on the CFO side. But we interviewed everybody: Bill, Steve Ballmer, Nathan Myhrvold, all the way through. There was a lot of legal due diligence done on the structure of the firm, any outstanding liabilities, things like that, and so we went ahead and prepared the prospectus. This was one of the more unusual ones because the company was doing very well, it was profitable.
Had plenty of revenues.
Yeah,
right?
And so it was a more straightforward kind of story than many where everything was on the come. And Microsoft in those days was not what it is today or what it became in the subsequent 10 years, but it was still pretty well known in technology circles, and Bill was iconic even then. And so, but one of the things we saw was that they also had a wonderful president, John Shirley, who Bill had recruited, and been a couple of others that hadn't worked out as well. But he found the right guy for sure there. And so, we had a good team, and we put together the prospectus. But one of the big things that you end up starting to do is trying to assess what is the price going to be at which this will sell, what's it likely to do in the aftermarket, and this is all before you've actually filed. And so, anyway, we had a memorable conversation where we had recommended that that they put in a range of $19 to $21 a share, and so it's pretty funny. I went up to Seattle, and I was up there, and this is before Redmond. This was Seattle, and Bill was in his office, and we made our recommendation. I got the guys in New York on the phone and everything. So I go out. So Bill was in there with Frank, and I'm looking through the glass, and they're just talking to themselves. And Bill is very, very animated and exercised, and I'm going, oh God, this is not looking good and everything. So after a while, they invite me back in, and we get the guys on the phone again, and Bill expresses the fact that he thinks that, this is really egregiously overpriced, and it ought to be, I guess maybe I've forgotten if it was 17 to 20. Anyway, we cut it, I think, to 16 to 19 to Bill's concerns. And so that was actually pretty funny. And so, but we went out, and then immediately it became absolutely clear that there's going to be massive interest in this, which we knew. And so part of what we had been doing was then creating the roadshow to approach institutional investors. And although Microsoft was very well known, the story wasn't known that well, and the people weren't known that well by the major institutional investors. We ended up starting at a computer conference, actually, that was going on, I've forgotten which one, where some of the techies were there, and it was kind of a good way to start it. I remember Dave Liddell came, and he was such a great fan and a strong supporter, and gave us a lot of good feedback. And then we started the roadshow, and we had started in Europe, and we went to London and Scotland. And I remember one of the funny things too is tells you how long ago this was. We had a big day of meetings, and so of course you have a dinner, and we went to the theater, and so we went to see this play, and Frank says, what is this play? And I said, well, it's about this guy, and he's practically destitute, and he's hiding from the law, and he becomes a priest, and another person steals from him, but he lets him go and everything. And then the police are after them. He says, God, this sounds terrible. He says, this better be good, because, we want a good evening tonight. And so I said, well, I hope so. Well, turns out it was Les Miserables. And so that was pretty good. It was about, it'd been going about, 2 weeks. And so
we had right opening.
Yeah, we had a fun time. Afterwards, we went to get a late dinner or something at Annabelle's, this nightclub. It's pitch dark. It was really big. We're way, way, way in the back. There's nobody there. And so we're there, and so Bill takes his coat off. And the guy comes running over. It's now like 11:30 at night. There's nobody else there. He says, sir, would you please put your coat back on? Okay. And so anyway, that was probably the last person who told Bill how to dress. And so anyway, we had a great time, and then came back. The road shows in the United States were very successful. And then it came the time where we started to get feedback. And we actually knew that there was more interest than the lower price range indicated. And so instead of 16 to 19, we raised it, I think, to something like 19 to 22, or I've forgotten the exact amount. And then we priced it at 22 or 23. And that was before the days of the big blowouts in the IPOs, and so the deal went up to 26 or 27 after it opened the next day, and so that was thought though to be a monumental success, especially since it was coming off a period of time where things have been really down. And I'll never forget this. Bill went to Australia for the pricing, so he just really left it with Frank, and Frank was I told you he liked to he liked to mix it up a little bit. So anyway, we had this giant negotiation over what the gross spread was going to be, over a 1 cent difference, which make no difference at all. And he was alleging that Bill was apoplectic about it and everything. Bill was down in Australia and anything. But finally, we settled on it, which I'm sure we caved, and that was the right thing to do. And the next day, though, we came and we went up to stand next to the OTC desk where we were opening the stock, and there's a guy named Victor Wright who was our partner in charge of the desk. Victor was great, and anyway, so finally, they get the enough input. They say, okay, we're going to make the first bid at 24 and a half, whatever it was, 25. And anyway, so I remember he went on this system that broadcasts what we're prepared to bid for the opening bid, and all of a sudden the phones explode. And Victor's a New York, he's going, buy it, sell it, buy it. Like this. The place is just crazy. And the stock starts coming across the tape like that. And Frank, who was a little rotund, but Frank, wore the suspenders and, vest and everything like that. And so he was there, and he was kind of back there, and we were all standing, and, we were saying that, God, this better work. And so all of a sudden it comes out, and it looks like it's going great. And Frank's kind of got his hands on his stomach, and his giant smile lights up and everything. And so, we were off and running. That was great. And so the aftermarket is the final thing that we do. Now, we had a lot of deals for other people later where the aftermarket is significantly tougher. And so, being willing to support the deal and managing that aftermarket can be more problematic than it was in that case.
There were a lot of what a spectacular story. It worked out just fine.
It did.
And your pricing turned out to be not only proven but exceeded. So there was a lot of churn in the market. There were other companies at the time. It was around the time of Oracle, is that right? And some others that were not as fortunate. Can you just give some context about how positive that was for that time and what it meant for you, why it was so significant?
Well, a lot of people don't realize that Microsoft, Oracle, and Sun all went public in the same week.
Same week, right?
Of March of 1986. And, honestly, I don't actually remember the immediate aftermarkets for Oracle and Sun, but they were, of course, both great companies. And so that really, I think, was the turning point for the market as a whole, because all of a sudden you had really, really good companies out there, and Microsoft, of course, with all of its profitability and everything, just did spectacularly well every quarter for a long time. And again, as I said, I don't remember the other two, but they did really well. And so I think it was an inflection point for technology in that entire period of time, and maybe ever, because these were the first of the companies. I mean, there was Intel and HP, but the first of the newly born companies that all of a sudden started up and did this. And so it was great for the industry. Needless to say, it was wonderful for Goldman and wonderful for my career. So I've always been very grateful, and I have admired the people at Microsoft for my whole life. And one of the things I admire is not just what Bill did as a businessman, but to see what he's done philanthropically. I don't know that there's ever been a philanthropic force as great as the Gates Foundation, and so it's interesting to see. Now, obviously, there's a lot of people that had a lot of business clashes, and there are different perspectives, but I think he's certainly one of the great people that's changed technology and actually is now changing our world. He initially got introduced there to help them analyze whether they would take their Claris software IPO public, or their subsidiary public. And it was led by Bill Campbell, God bless him. What a wonderful man. And so we went down to work with them, and it turned out that, Claris's financial performance never really permitted it to become a public company. And so it ended up getting reabsorbed back into Apple later on. But in the process of that, not only did we get to know Bill, but we got to know Al Eisenstadt and John Scully and others who were instrumental at the company. And so we started doing a lot of work with Apple. And we worked on a number of strategic projects, most of which didn't come to fruition, seeking partners or minority investments and things like that. And meanwhile, Apple was continuing to struggle. And ultimately, John left, and Michael Spindler became CEO. And even though Michael was more of an operator, he was still unsuccessful in turning the company around, and things were just getting worse and worse. And so finally they brought in Gil Amelio, who had been at National Semiconductor. And Gil was a noted manager and a good manager at National Semiconductor, and the thought was that he could sort of rally the troops and make the company sustainable. Turned out that wasn't actually true, but at the time it looked that way. But Apple was down to barely having enough money to meet payroll in a couple of weeks. I mean, they were really in dire straits. And so we proposed a overnight convertible debenture to the board. And the board was also talking to, I think, Morgan Stanley, who said it couldn't be done. And we thought it could. And it was a gutsy deal because we would end up basically buying it and selling it all in one, in overnight. And so anyway, we put that deal together, and it turned out to be a $660 million convertible debenture, which was very, very well received. And so the company got the money to stay alive. And honestly, I think that was one of the deals that is most gratifying to me. I mean, I was only a small part of it, but still to have worked on that and to see what Apple's become. And of course, I love Apple products anyway. And but that was really great. Now, the amazing thing about it was, though, the premise was kind of new management. We're going to, run this company the right way. Well, Gil was really not successful in that, and ultimately, he and the board parted ways, and that's when they brought back Steve. And so during this period when it really wasn't going well, the price of the stock went down, and so the convertible debentures were underwater. But Steve came back, and I would say probably in about a year or so, if memory serves, he had righted the ship. And by a couple of years out, things were really starting to happen. And so people who invested in that ended up making a lot of money, if they held it. And maybe not for all the reasons we might have forecast, but our fundamental belief in the Apple franchise was there. But Steve was amazing. And fun thing for me was we had met Steve. He had selected us to work with him at Next. And we advised him in I think it was $100 million investment that a Japanese firm made in the company. And so we started working on an IPO for them. But, the economics of the PC business were pretty tough. And, whether that IPO was ever going to happen or not is questionable. But at that time, then Apple found that they really had to do something about their operating system. And so they were talking to Next and a couple of other companies about acquisition, not really to buy the company, but to get the the foundation of a new operating system. And so that was fascinating because we were talking to Steve, we were talking to Apple, and we were kind of informally in the middle of it. And that deal did happen. And so when it happened, though, Gil was still running the company, and Steve, had his estrangement from Apple, and so he wasn't real sure that this was going to work out. And so he was kind of keeping his distance. And as things slid, the board made the decision that they really needed to ask Steve to come back as CEO. And I was there for at least some of those discussions, and I thought it was a very courageous decision on their part, because these were, of course, the people who had let Steve go to begin with, and they loved this company dearly, but they also knew bringing Steve back that it would end their tenure there. And but they made the decision, and Steve came back, but he wouldn't be CEO because he didn't really know at the beginning if he could save it or not. So he took the role of interim CEO and used to sit over in this little office, and the old CEO office was empty. But as I say, though, when he came back, he made 5 decisions, any one of which would have put him in the all-time Hall of Fame. Pretty much the first 2 of which were, one is to simplify the product line and get the number of SKUs down, and the second was to not license the operating system. So this was really a little awkward because Gil had decided to opt to license it, and there were actually some agreements out there. And so Fred Anderson, wonderful man and a great CFO, was sent out to go tell all the people, well, forget that little agreement, that never existed, forget it. And so they kind of worked through that. But so Apple went back to being Apple. And then, but the products succeeded, and then of course came the iPod, and after the iPod, the iPhone and the iPad, and then Apple became, the largest company in the history of the world. And so it was really fun to see that. And of course, a lot of that growth later happened after I had retired from Goldman, but it never ceases to gratify me when I see Apple succeeding. So
it's amazing. That's $1 trillion valuation, in the way that devices are in, literally a billion hands around the world. I'd like to know a little bit more about that gutsy decision as you described it. Apple really was on the ropes and financially was sputtering within weeks of being able to have any operating cash. So what possessed you and the rest of the team to really come up with that kind of a approach and feel like that was the right solution at the time?
Well, honestly, I do think that we really believed in the Apple franchise, and that people wanted Apple products, and that it was really a question of putting together a business structure around it that would make that possible. And so, fundamentally, we believed that this was something that people wanted and needed. Secondly, we thought that there were some good ideas, and that there was a new operating system on the charts, and we really thought that could happen, especially if we raised enough money to give them the runway to do it. And so, but of course, there was no guarantee that was going to happen. And to that, I am not sure that any person in the whole world besides Steve could have saved the company. So I don't blame, the Gil or any of the other people. And had they gone out and gotten one of the greatest people ever, I'm not sure they could have done it, because a lot of it had to do with Steve's persona, him bringing back the magic to Apple. There was something that was all part of the marketing that sort of reinvigorated the company. But even though our rationale was good, it was very risky. And in fact, I was at a retired partners meeting in New York with the guy who on the equity capital's market desk did the deal is named Mike Ryan, another fantastic, talented pro. And Mike and I were talking, and we were talking about, here's that deal. And he says, we were crazy to ever do that. And we probably were. He said, looking back, we were crazy, but it worked out. So
you had this chance to not only meet Steve early in his next days, but then work with him, go through this time of difficult transition and see him kind of take the helm again. How would you describe him, and what made him the right person, the only person, as you've described it, to be able to do that?
Well, of course, the life of Steve Jobs has been pretty well documented, but Steve was brilliant and all of that, but what he had was a force of personality and a charisma that was unmatched in my entire history. He had a purpose, a charm, a ingenuity that when he approached you and he wanted you to do something he wanted, it was practically impossible not to do it. It was like an electromagnetic force was operating on you, getting you to turn. And Walter Isaacson wrote about his reality distortion theory. And part of the reason I think Steve had that was that his force of personality was such that he could change the reality to what he wanted it to be. And he was unbelievable. And now that same, that same force of character demonstrated itself in other ways and other times. But he could be very, very hard on people. But if you were part of the group that he actually respected and trusted, even when he was tough on you, it kind of just came with the territory. It wasn't that bad. And honestly, most of the people I know that ended up working with him over a longer period of time just thought the world of him, even though he did have his human failings like the rest of us.
Is there an incident or a story that, from your own experience, that could help illustrate this?
Well, I can illustrate some of the hard times. I'll never forget, Steve had gone off to do Next, and it was just, it was really secret. Steve didn't let anybody in, and so we didn't, I think I might have called down there or something. We never got to see him. So one day I'm kind of standing in the office, and my assistant puts the phone call on hold and says, Eff, it's Steve Jobs on the line. And I go, Steve Jobs is on the line, And so anyway, I went over to take it, and he goes, hello, Eff. And he told us, he wanted some ideas, and, we set up a meeting to go down there and everything. And honestly, the first two words he said, which are not exactly remarkable, were just so, he took advantage of his reputation. He had the persona, and we did a lot of work. And what our contribution really in that part was to suggest that in raising money, he turned to Japan rather than trying to do something with institutional investors in Europe. And so Steve actually did most of the negotiating of the deal, but we helped and guided at least the concept, and then we started helping put together an IPO if it, if there ever had been one. The other thing though was there was a time Steve wanted us to raise some more money, and the markets were bad. Next was, was doing okay, but it wasn't doing great. And anyway, Steve had come to New York, and we were having lunch with our senior partner, Bob Rubin. And so anyway, it was just kind of a meet the senior people stuff. And so anyway, we had this really delightful lunch, and Bob said to me, he said, what a great guy. He said, I'm so glad we've got him as a client. And I said, well, Bob, he can be plenty tough. And there may come a time when you get a phone call about, some stuff that we can or can't do. And so, remember that just remember that part too. So anyway, we go, and about 6 or 8 months later, this comes up, and we're not able to really get Steve what he wants in this deal. And we told him, Steve, I don't think we ever went in the market. We said, Steve, this just isn't going to happen. And so that was not what he wanted to hear. So he called Bob Rubin. I had a conversation with Bob, and Bob called me and said, Eff, well, I heard from Steve Jobs, and he wasn't very happy. And I said, yeah, I assume it's about the private placement. He said, yeah. He said, you told me I might get a call like that. And I said, and I'm sure glad I did, Bob. And so, but see, the point there was, I don't criticize Steve for that. He was trying to get done what he needed to get done. It turned out we were right. It just wasn't going to happen. And so we went on to the next thing, and we went back to working with him, closely. And so, but Steve had plenty of steel in him. Let me say that.
So how long did that relationship with Apple last, from early days with Steve at Next before he came in, and then?
Well, the Apple relationship, all it went back into probably the late 80s, again, with Bill at Claris.
Oh, with Claris, that's
with
right.
Bill Campbell, and then Al Eisenstadt and John Scully. But the relationship at Goldman remains very strong with Apple today, and Apple is really one of Goldman Sachs' foremost clients. And so when I left, a fellow named Gene Sykes kind of took over the helm along with Ken Hirsch, and it is a very, very close relationship, and one of the ones that we absolutely treasure. I still say we all these years later, but
I'm sure they say we also, thinking about you since you helped build the whole business. Well, let's talk about another company. What should we talk about next?
Well, I love Juniper Networks a little bit later. Juniper was a company that got founded with a lot of questions about whether it ought to be able to succeed. It was basically going after Cisco, which is one of the great companies that had been built, and basically doing higher end routers. And so they, however, did a brilliant job conceiving of the product and then starting to execute on it. And so, they had a strong team. Scott Krenz had come in as the CEO. Pradeep Sinu was the technical genius, and Marcel Ghani was the CFO. Those were the people we worked with the most. And they had one of these bake-offs. And it was actually kind of hilarious because they were very, very concerned about giving out any numbers and everything. And so they kept saying, well, what is the valuation? And we kept saying, well, like, what are the revenues? What are the projections? I mean, we don't just make these things up. And so they'd go, well, you know enough about our general trajectory. So anyway, it was absolutely very funny. And we had a research analyst named Mary Henry, who was, I would say, beyond sensational, that really helped us a great deal in this. And they wanted to be associated with her. And we did everything we could, and we're fortunate to win the mandate for this company against everybody. And so one of the great things about the company was that they described their routers as purpose-built, and because they were designed for a very specific function and at this high end, and so it was a very clever way of marketing it that sort of made sense and highlighted what they did. And but Juniper itself was purpose-built. Scott Krenz, one of the most thoughtful persons, really rational, a great human being, and he really built the company to have a lot of teamwork and to be focused. It's really a company that was built almost with textbook-like qualities of building a team and motivating people. And so I remember we were in New York for the pricing. We priced it, and this was one of those insane markets where no matter how high you price it, it doubles, and then it goes up some more from there, and then goes all over. It was just a crazy market. But they were there, and we priced it in the late afternoon, and they flew back to New York to be with the team for that day and to celebrate. And I remember talking to Scott. We were on some kind of I don't even know if we had video feeds, but a connection, and the whole company was there to celebrate, and of course the thing became enormously successful. Went through its downturn when the whole market turned, of course, but it remains an outstanding company, and one that I got a lot of gratification out of because the people are so good. And in fact, Scott has gone on. I believe he's still chairman of the company, but he has a magnificent foundation and built a tremendous retreat center up here. But he's doing work with all sorts of great causes, and so I remain close to him today. And Marcel's my neighbor now, and whenever I see Pradeep, I light up in smiles. So it's just a great group of people that I'm just very privileged to have been associated with.
You've worked with remarkable leaders that were both pioneers in innovation and also disruptors in the world of entrepreneurship and building their companies. Are there any others that you would like to talk about? Stories, and also what you sort of took away from that experience with them?
Well, I loved being associated with Hewlett-Packard. We did a number of mergers for them, or mergers, acquisitions, little ones, because they really didn't do any big acquisitions until much later. But I got to be in front of the board with my colleagues quite a few times actually, and Bill and Dave were still there, and then they were older, but they were still lions, and so what a thrill that was. John Young was the CEO, and I thought he was incredibly gifted, and so that was really a remarkable experience. I did see there, though, how difficult it is for companies to continue into another generation beyond the founders, and so I think, and I also, HP was also great. The HP way, they empowered their people, and it was very good for a while, but it also got to be a little dysfunctional, I thought, where too many people were going their own ways, and this is just a very difficult thing to manage. And so, HP has continued to do well overall, but I learned a lot. I got to work on the Agilent spinoff, the first of the spinoffs, and then I was only peripherally associated, but Goldman was involved in the others, and so, I thought that those were probably good transactions that needed to happen to, kind of get back to the focus. But it really illustrates how tough it is to sustain businesses. And you look at AT&T, one of the great companies forever. Well, the company that bears the AT&T name is not that historic company. It's another company that outdid AT&T and took the name. And IBM, the greatest of all companies in the 50s, 60s, 70s, is more of a player in a more narrow field, and they've done a very, very good job of innovating and recreating themselves. But still, it's a great lesson about how hard it is to keep companies going in the face of this constant technological change. And the companies that, a lot of these companies used to be small disruptors, and now they're fighting all the other disruptors that are coming after them. And it is a fascinating part of the Silicon Valley technology ecosystem that is, I have a great deal of respect for people who have to manage that, especially on the bigger companies trying to play defense.
I'd like to return to that conversation about the ecosystem a little bit later, but before we leave talking about HP and its seminal influence on the Valley and its culture, were there any experiences or occasions that you can remember seeing Bill or Dave in action that really helped kind of crystallize who they were and why HP was so significant for this place?
Well, not really, honestly, because I only saw them in board meetings in their very, very latter years.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I talked with just dozens and maybe hundreds of people who had grown up under their leadership, and the ability that they had to infuse their personal value system and to let the people feel like they were in touch with the senior leaders. That gets pretty hard, though, if you have 150,000 employees. So, but they did a great job with that, and they did have a very distinct philosophy about excellence and management that obviously made the company enormously successful. There were so many other great companies, though. I spent a lot of time personally working with Sun Microsystems, which talk about a scrappy brawler that came up against all odds. That was a lot of fun, and they used technological innovation and caught a good market segment and really did a great job. Anyway. So.
Any moments there, a story that you could kind of help us understand what your relationship was working with Scott or others at the time with?
Well, gosh. One of our first deals that we did for them was when they sold 20% of the company to AT&T. Mm-hmm. But the way the price was set would be there was some initial amount up front for 5% or something like that, or 2%. And then the company would put stock to AT&T at a price. And the way the price was negotiated was that it would be the average of the last 30 days. And so, that one of the funny things about that is that there was so much volatility in the market and the stock and everything like that the stock would be at 30, and then it would go to 18 or something like that. That's just the way these things happened. And so the thing about it was that this 30-day deal actually turned out to be great for Sun and not so good for AT&T, because Sun would go, we're making our put today. So we've got 1 day of 18 and 29 days of 30. So, you get this very high price. And so it turned out that we had a lot of fun negotiating that. It turned out well. And, of course, Sun did well and AT&T did fine, and they were giant. But I don't know, that was fun. I always got kind of a big kick out of that, the way it worked. And but they were. I just loved the fighting spirit. There's almost no time you ever spent with Scott McNeely that you didn't see the fighting spirit. So I don't know. I'm hard pressed to come up with one.
That's great. We've talked about some of the great deals that you led, and you've also along the way talked about these bake-offs that happened, and there were deals that went the other way or deals that even didn't materialize. I think Pixar might be an example of that. Could you, because not for those who are looking at the business and trying to understand that not everything always turns out perfectly. Well, do you want to talk about that, or any other example?
Sure, I can think of a bunch of them. Pixar was one. Steve asked us to look at that for him, and so Toy Story was in production, but it was coming out in about 3 months or 4 months or something like that. And I remember we went over there with Steve, and I sat in the little theater, and John Lasseter came in, and they had all the storyboards, and then we saw a bunch of the things that had been filmed and everything, and it looked great, but I mean, who knows, right? And so Steve's position was he wanted to go public before the film was released.
Oh, really?
And so and we said, Steve, I don't think that makes sense. And he says, well, look, it's so evident that this is going to be successful that we want to go beforehand. And we're going like, well, it would be more evident to us if we went after and we could look at the results, and which is, I think, a pretty reasonable position. But we also had a research analyst at the time. This was not technology; it was an entertainment analyst who really didn't think that the movie business with the hits business, you have one and then the next one wasn't coming out for 2 years. And so you're kind of going like, well, what's going to happen for 2 years here? And but nonetheless, it turned out in the end that we just said, Steve, we can't do it. We don't have the internal support, and the plan doesn't fit us. And he said, Steve was great. He said, fine, I respect that. He went with, I think it was Robertson Stevens, I'm not sure. But we ended up doing a lot of work with Steve afterwards at Apple. That's what I said. He was very fair. He knew we tried. He knew that we had given it our best shot. He knew that we were thinking, and even though it wasn't what he wanted, he recognized that it was not like just some crazy position on our part. And so it really didn't affect our relationship with him in all the other ways. But of course, we didn't get to do that great deal, as it turned out. But there were so many others. I remember that we had solicited SanDisk, Eli Harari. I loved Eli Harari. I just thought he was great. And we ended up not winning the mandate and had to co-manage that deal behind Morgan Stanley and kind of eat dirt. And so, and I don't think they went out of their way to make life easy for us. But what I'm very proud of is that we ended up doing many additional transactions for SanDisk over a long period of years. And so the decision to kind of swallow our pride and not to be, not to just go off in a huff, but that turned out to have been a great decision economically and the ability to have a relationship with such a great group of people and company. And so we did the great lion's share of everything they did thereafter.
These one journalist wrote about this, what he called it, described as a star system that was going on, that it was really built around these incredible people, and then the teams that were around. You were here, Frank Quattrone was another, and there were others. And one characterization said Eff Martin of Goldman Sachs was quieter and more understated, a warm smile, and conveyed a polished and polite demeanor. If Frank Quattrone came across as Wild West, Martin was more establishment East.
Well, I would actually maybe take a little bit of exception. It was, it's natural that the leaders of certain efforts are going to get a lot of focus on it, but we went to considerable effort not to make me or anybody else at Goldman the star, because that's inherently a bad business model, and we also, it's just not our culture. And so what we emphasized over and over and over again is not this one person, but this team, of which we said everybody on this team's a star, and we endeavored to make it that way. It is true that Goldman was I think we eschewed some of the dramatics and the sort of fireworks and things like that. And we always did less entertaining, not no entertaining, but less entertaining than others and things like that. And our approach has always been that we're just going to do the very best job for you. And so, sometimes that sold well, sometimes it didn't, but we found that over the long term, it sold really well. And that's what we really tried to emphasize. And one of my actual greatest satisfactions, and I mentioned this, I left a voicemail for the whole technology group the day I left Goldman, and I said that I was very proud that every major relationship was in better condition as I was leaving than after a period of transition than it had ever been in. And again, I think it's the mark of good business, good people, good firms, that not that you leave and you're the star and it falls apart, but that it gets better and better because you did your part in building the right foundation. And that's just the way Goldman Sachs thinks.
That says so much about the firm and about you. I'd like to ask you about, just to have a better sense of the unique kind of value proposition, but also that culture. It's not easy when you have to build that kind of a culture that sustains over time. How do you explain what was sort of the recipe for Goldman having that in its DNA?
Well, I think part of it is just started that way. This is Goldman Sachs' 150th year, and we just celebrated the kickoff of it back in New York. And the firm grew up with, as I mentioned, German Jewish families that were together, and there was always a sense that this is a family. And maybe we were a little patriarchal in the early days, but there was a sense that we're in this together, we're going to take care of the employees. The Sachs family stayed in the business longer than the Goldmans, but the feeling was that our names are on the door. And so there was, again, this just inherent culture that started in the beginning. The second thing was, though, that this was one of the longest lasting partnerships where economically everyone's fate was tied together. And so, in a year that investment banking did terrible and fixed income did great, I made the same amount of money as vice versa. And so therefore, there was this big incentive to help the people, whether it's in your division or another division, and it brought together a collegiality that was spawned by economic interests. And even after Goldman Sachs went public, there is in the firm a still partnership that where some of the economic rewards are shared on the basis of percentages and partnership that is preserving this culture.
As you reflect on your, is it 22 years?
22.
At there, you've talked about some of the things that you felt were most significant in terms of your impact and that you were grateful to be a part of the culture, the relationships. Is there anything else that you would add as you look back at that chapter in your life?
Well, of course, being at Goldman Sachs, one of the great firms, gave me a platform. And so I got to work with pretty much everybody, or at least know them, or have some interaction with every major figure in certainly West Coast technology. And, that wouldn't have happened if it were Eff Martin on his own. And so I am really grateful for that opportunity because, we never did a lot of business with Larry Ellison, but I had a lot of fun with him, and he's a good friend. And one of the riches of my experience is that I got to know somebody like Larry. I mean, it was awesome. And so that's just, one of those things that happens. The other thing, though, is that I got to know so many great people at Goldman Sachs. We went back to this retired partners dinner last December, and there were 350 retired partners there from all over the world. And honestly, they almost couldn't organize the dinner because all anybody wanted to do was just talk to each other. And where do you ever go where there's 250 people that you want to spend an hour with? I mean, there's just that is a remarkable experience that I got to have. And actually, it remains one of the strengths of the firm, and they're really smart. They do a lot to try to keep this alumni network together and then in touch with the firm. But seeing those people, that's just the greatest thing.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. I'd like to kind of ask your opinion about Silicon Valley. You came in early years, when you arrived at Stanford, when it was still in its very young years, and you've been not only an observer but a keen person who's helped support and enable its growth into its epicenter. So many people come to the museum, come to Silicon Valley and ask, what's the secret sauce of this place? What enables it to create and recreate its leading edge? What would you say to people who ask that kind of question?
Well, I think I would just reference maybe your earlier term on the ecosystem. One of the things that we've got here is that we've got all of the ingredients in place. The great educational institutions, we've got a robust legal community, a robust banking community, still the leading venture capital community. And now, maybe more important than anything else, we have a history where young entrepreneurs can see dozens and hundreds and even thousands of stories of people who succeeded. And as I said, when I came out of business school, no one said, well, I think I'll go start a company. And today, that's a huge segment of the population, and that's based upon being able to watch this shared history. And then, of course, with that success, there are a number of entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, investors who have participated in this, and so they're there for these young people. And so one of the lessons that I always say that I learned is that young people can do anything. And so even when we started the firm that I'm now, somewhat associated with, that we helped found, Anthos Capital, we put two guys in business who were 30 years old coming directly out of Stanford Business School when everybody told us we were crazy because they're 30, they haven't done anything, et cetera, et cetera. We said, no, we worked with them at Goldman. We know how good they are. And so we helped them for a while with a little age and gravitas, and now they're doing great. And they're better investors than I am by far. And so, it's just that they might not have gotten started if they were in an area of the country where people just didn't, buy into the young people can do things mentality.
Well, let's talk about Anthos. So you had your final day at Goldman. You made the phone call. Were there any other parts that you want to mention about you ending you made your decision to end?
Well, I retired as a partner in November of 2002, and then I stayed as an advisory director and worked on quite a bit of stuff through 2005. But at that time, it was become clear that the transitions were really in place, and that was good. And I didn't want to get in the way of the young guys totally establishing themselves. And then second of all, I was ready to do something else. And so the one piece of advice I'd gotten was don't make any quick decisions. And truthfully, I was tired. I mean, Goldman Sachs was fabulous and a wonderful, wonderful career, but it was demanding. And I actually think that I made over 500 separate trips to New York from the Bay Area, 250 of which were on red eyes. I used to get on the red eye. God, it seemed like every 2 weeks with Tony's son, who was at Venrock, because Tony was the West Coast guy, and God, he was going back, and we're getting there. And I go, oh, no, not you again. And so it was really funny. But I took some time then to actually just decompress. And one of the things I learned was it's a big world, and it's bigger than business. It's bigger than Silicon Valley. And that I started doing more and more in the philanthropic area and with our Christian community as I had more time. And then it was not till 2007 that we actually put together Anthos. So it was a couple of years between leaving Goldman and starting Anthos.
And what was the vision for Anthos? You'd been a seasoned investor, and this was something new that you started with a lot people, alumni that you brought with you.
Well, truthfully, I was not a seasoned investor. I was a seasoned investment banker, but that's more the sell side than the buy side. I had very little experience putting my own money to work and or somebody else's money that I'm responsible for, at least directly. And so that was one of the things that really attracted me, because it gave me a chance to stay involved with some people that I really, really admired. My friend Tom Healy from New York, and Gavin Davis, who'd been our senior economist in London, and then Brian Kelly and Paul Farr, who are now the managing directors of Anthos. And so it was fun, the five of us, going to work together and starting it. And but a lot of it, it was, we're all going into this. I think Gavin and Tom had been a little bit more principal investing than I had, but the thrill of the chase was there, and to learn new things.
So can you give just some sense of the scale of the initial fund as you started and some of those early deals that Anthos pursued?
Yeah, we started with a $30 million fund, and we closed it down after about 22 or 4 because we were starting a second fund, and we hadn't gotten much back yet. And so we the next fund was 70 million, and in that fund we brought in some other investors, but still the three of us were the major. And so then the first fund started to have some payoffs that had done well, and the second fund was looking promising. So we raised a third fund then, which was 300 million, and that brought in the pension funds and major investment arms, and not only family offices but other investment counselors and things like that to get to that size. And the guys, sure, we've had setbacks, but they've done really well overall. And the firm moved from Menlo Park down to Santa Monica, and so I think we've got 17 or 18 people there in Santa Monica, and then still Tom, Gavin, and I are over here. When we were really, really small, we used to say grandly that we had offices in London, New York, and San Francisco, because that's where Gavin lived, that's where Tom lived, that's where I was. But now we can even include Los Angeles.
So we were talking about Silicon Valley and your kind of perspectives, not only on strengths, but perhaps some of the challenges. I'd like to hear your perspective on some of the challenges. Some people have raised questions about talent flow, or about ethics, or about reinvention and new technologies. What are the kind of challenges that you see on the horizon for this place?
Well, I'm going to start with the easier ones, and these aren't easy. I actually think that the infrastructure challenge is huge, and I mean, this traffic is crazy, and we really, really need some solutions to that, and people working toward it. And there are some people doing it, but by and large, the political will to really put in a mass transportation system, or to do other things. And so I actually feel like we're at the point where people are just going to say no mas, that it's not worth it. And what will inevitably happen is more companies will get started outside of Silicon Valley, or get started here and then move, et cetera. So I think that's a really big challenge. I think there's also an important social challenge, that when I started, technology were not really the haves. We were the scrappy little people trying to find something to do and build a life. And now it's the biggest business in the world. And there really is a great social divide, where the problems of driving people out of their houses by running prices up, and which not any one individual is doing, but is part of the system. And I really love to see that Microsoft committed $500 million for housing, and Facebook and Salesforce and so many others have gotten involved in the community to try to address these issues. But I think everybody's got to be involved with those, or else the system will crumble on itself. And finally, I think there's a really, really important personal challenge that every single person here has to address, and that is keeping success and the desire for success in perspective, and not letting it become the major element of your life. I remember in the internet boom when things really took off around 2000, that sort of thing. The head of our investment banking group was out, and I was taking him around to meet people, and he said to me, Silicon Valley is now known as the greed capital of the world. And I thought to myself, this guy from Wall Street is telling me we're the greed capital of the world. But it was, he wasn't making just some wild assertion. It was really true. And I think that internet bubble and the excesses there showed that there were some bad judgments being made. And I talk to so many people that are so wrapped up now in the thrill of it, the hope for glory and success and power and money and influence, that that is the goal of their life. And it becomes all-encompassing in the 22-and-a-half-hour work days and all of these things. And so I hope, though, that we can find within our people and teach our people a greater purpose in life than that, not to exclude that, but there is more to life than making money and winning at business and things like that. And so I think we've got to see some greater value system than just what I have, what I've accomplished, and what other people say about me. And that is one of the things I'm doing now is I'm teaching a course at Santa Clara University with my friend Chip Adams, which he has really designed, but it's called Conscientious Capitalism. And it teaches that as a work ethic for building good companies, but also there's a major leadership development component where we say that in order to be a good leader, you have to be a good person first. In order to lead others, you have to lead yourself first. And I'd really hope that more broadly, we as a technology community and Silicon Valley community could tackle the value issue in addition to everything else.
It's so important. And how maybe not enough people are focusing their energy. What else, in addition to teaching, what else do you think can be done to tackle that value issue?
Well, of course, I think we can take our own advice and try to live it ourselves and be models to people. I think it's important that the people who set the ideas and tone of Silicon Valley reflect that. And so one thing that I hear a lot is that Silicon Valley companies are all greedy and don't do much philanthropically. And I don't actually think that's right at all. It might have been true back in the early days, but it's not true now. And I would just encourage, though, that everybody get on that bandwagon, both corporately and then individually. And I would say that Silicon Valley has sustained itself thus far because enough people have done it. But we're getting bigger, the rewards are greater, the temptations are greater. It breaks my heart to see someone misled, like apparently was the case in Theranos. And so I think that we've all got to step up and just not let the desire for success so permeate our young people that they lose their way.
This is really at the heart of the mission of the Computer History Museum, to not only preserve the legacy, but to help turn it to both inform and inspire the next generation. Do you have any advice for what a museum as a cultural institution might do to help that next generation?
Well, I think you're keeping the memory alive. That's one thing, and a very, very great thing. I actually think that museums have a pretty unique ability to cross all the lines of companies and bring together resources and memories, and then to reach out and ask people to come in and see them. I mean, we've seen that for centuries with art museums. And so, one of the things that I hope the Computer History Museum will do is not only emphasize the technology, but the values and the quality of the people. And there have been some fabulous, fabulous people as human beings that have also been tremendous successes in the Silicon Valley and in computer history.
Thank you. Well, that's our mandate, and we'll continue on that. I'd like to ask you about other parts of your life, because your professional success has been, and your professional work and impact has been significant. There are other parts that are very important to you, your philanthropic work, your community service, your faith you've mentioned. Can you describe some of those areas that are important to you and what you're working on?
Sure. Well, the biggest area of emphasis in my life and my wife's life now is basically to try to develop our own faith and then also help others develop their Christian faith. And we've been involved in a sort of a general process of Christianity called spiritual formation, which the best definition I've heard of it is the process of being conformed to the image of Christ for the sake of others. And so it's a more intentional way of trying to dedicate oneself to become more like Jesus through his power, but also emulating the way he lived, and then apply that for the benefit of all, not just to make me feel like I'm better. And so we do quite a bit of teaching. We founded several educational institutes to try to promote the intellectual background and underpinnings of spiritual formation through a man named Dallas Willard. And one of the great things I have a lot of fun with is I get to meet with a number of groups of young business people on a pretty routine basis, and either study books that we're getting together or, from time to time give talks, et cetera. So that's really a great passion of ours. But whether people are interested in Christianity right now or not, everybody needs help. And so we're also just trying to do what we can to help educational opportunities. One place we've been involved with, Garfield School, which is a K-8 school in Redwood City. It sits about 250 yards north of the border of Atherton. It's over 90% of its people are below the poverty line, primarily Hispanic, and it just strikes me as unimaginable that 250 yards away from the wealthiest conclave pretty much anywhere is a school that doesn't even have portable computers or iPads or technology or support services for this community of really important human beings that are our future. So, we're trying to do, work with the Boys and Girls Club and with Garfield School directly. I'll just put in a plug. Garfield School and the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula are two of the finest institutions I've ever seen with great leadership. And but many people in Silicon Valley are supporting things like that, and it's really worthwhile to try to make life better and actually to hold our society together.
It's a countervailing force to what we were talking about, this increasing divide. And I appreciate you talking about what you and your wife are doing. I see you've been involved with also in the arts and culture world and music as well. Do you want to say anything about that?
Sure. I had the privilege of joining the board of the San Francisco Symphony when I was the Goldman partner in San Francisco, and that was really fun. One of the most ably led nonprofit institutions I've ever seen, Nancy Bechtel and John Goldman and now Sacco Fisher, and it is a spectacular group of people. And done a lot of wonderful work. I am not musically talented myself. That was not part of my background, but I love music. And one of the things that we then drifted into is chamber music. And we got involved with a chamber music festival called Music at Menlo, which is now in its 17th year. And it's led by David Finkel and Wuhan, husband and wife, who also run the Chamber Music Society in Lincoln Center and are pretty much at the pinnacle of the chamber music world. And that has been so wonderful for us because chamber music is a more personal experience. You're right up close and involved. And but to go back to Silicon Valley, our chairman and one of the great people who've supported this is Ann Bowers, who was Bob Noyce's widow, and she is a fantastic force for good in our community and has been such a great sponsor. And her particular interest is in the young students that are being trained, not just the concerts for everybody to come and amuse themselves at. And she has been such a force for good in helping young students be trained in their life and in their musical careers.
I'm a personal recipient of that. I'm a regular at Music and Mellow. My husband actually leads a parallel life as a musician.
Oh, right.
And has his own trio. We could talk about that.
What does he play? What instrument?
He's a pianist.
Oh, great.
But he also heads up a nonprofit here in the Valley that works on things like transportation. We can talk about those leagues later.
Great.
But just as we come to the close of our time, I want to thank you so much and ask, I know that you have a family and generations of family. As you think back about your own life and the impact that it's had, this is an opportunity maybe to share for your family and also for other, the next generation of people that will be following you. What are the things that have brought you the most meaning in the way that you measure your life, both professionally and personally?
Well, gratitude is pretty high up there. As I think back on the way I've been blessed and the people that I've been able to be associated with, I recently had a major health issue, and I'm very grateful to be here talking with you today. And so I've just been the beneficiary of wonderful business people, wonderful friends, a great family, wonderful people at Stanford Hospital. And so that is one thing. And I think gratitude is one of the most important characteristics that we can cultivate to have a satisfying life and to see life in perspective. And then I'm also a believer. One of the great lessons I learned was that no matter what you lost, no matter how bad things went, to never give up and to just keep going back again and again with your best shot. And that failure is so ephemeral, and failure is really not what it appears to be. And learning that was one of the great lessons of my life, because there's going to be a lot of failures in life and a lot of things that are very difficult to deal with. But I appreciate the chance to have seen that if one just has tenacity and persists, that good things can happen.
That leads us to earlier today. I did ask you about your one word of advice that you might give. You chose tenacity. Is there a story or an example that would help bring this to life as a principle for somebody else to emulate?
Well, I would say that hopefully this whole record is going to talk a little bit about not giving up in the face of not having the platform initially to get chosen for the linear technology IPO, but staying with it and building relationships with other companies and ultimately building a business that succeeded overall. I would say that it's if you look at some of our biggest, Sun Microsystems, we did not do their IPO. We became their lead banker primarily. The same was true with so many others. We didn't start with Apple, but that's one of our great clients. We certainly didn't start with Cisco. We've had a very, very fine relationship with them. And so I just saw that repeatedly professionally. But, I've also seen that every life, every family has its ups and downs, and just staying together and not giving up on each other and holding on is one of the great lessons I've had the privilege of learning. And if I can pass that on to our kids, I'll be very grateful. And speaking of grateful, if I'd had another word, if you'd give me two words, the other one would have been gratitude, which I just talked about.
Well, thank you so much, Eff Martin. On behalf of the Computer History Museum, I want to thank you. It's been a great privilege and a pleasure to spend time with you, to have you say in your own words to take us on the journey of your remarkable life and its impact for us here. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been an honor to be here.
Thanks.